Outside, a relentless wind tore through the skeletal branches of winter trees, rattling the very bones of the small cottage. Inside, 78-year-old Agnes Carmichael held her breath, her gaze fixed not on the storm, but on the solitary loaf of bread sitting on her worn kitchen counter. It was barley bread, already a day old, and it was undeniably, starkly, her last. Enough for a whisper of toast tomorrow, perhaps. Maybe not even that. The gnawing emptiness in her pantry mirrored the hollow ache of loneliness in her chest, a constant companion these past few years. Then, slicing through the wind's desolate howl, came a sound that pierced her solitude, a thin, desperate whimper right outside her door. Just moments later, driven by an empathy that defied her own scarcity, Agnes would offer half of that precious loaf to the terrified stray dog huddled in the tempest. She couldn't possibly fathom then that this simple act, sharing her near last morsel with a creature as lost as she sometimes felt, wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a first thread in an unbelievable tapestry, leading her directly to a life-changing secret her beloved late husband had buried years ago, a hidden fortune waiting for the most unlikely of guides. Agnes had lived in this cottage, perched on the quiet edge of Oakhaven town, for almost 50 years. It was sturdy, built with love by her husband, Arthur, but time and meager finances had left their marks. Paint peeled gently from the window frames like sunburnt skin. The garden gate leaned at a weary angle, and inside, the floral wallpaper had faded, bearing silent witness to decades of laughter, tears, and quiet routines. Arthur had been gone 5 years now, but his presence lingered in the scent of pipe tobacco faintly embedded in his old armchair, in the stack of whimsical books filled with dog-eared pages and cryptic notes about local legends and buried treasures he swore existed nearby. He'd been a man fueled by dreams and dandelion wine, always sketching fantastical inventions or poring over dusty maps, convinced that adventure, and perhaps fortune, lay just beyond the next hedgerow. Agnes, grounded and practical, had managed their humble finances, tended her small but vital vegetable patch, and loved him fiercely, even when his head was firmly in the clouds. His absence now was a vast silence, punctuated only by the ticking grandfather clock in hall and the lonely whistle of the kettle. Her days followed a quiet, predictable rhythm dictated by necessity and habit. Mornings began with weak tea in the chipped blue mug Arthur had always preferred, gazing out at the often gray sky. Afternoons were for mending, turning frayed cuffs, patching worn knees with meticulous, almost invisible stitches learned from her own mother. Trips to the village shop were carefully orchestrated affairs, each item on her list weighed against the dwindling balance in her purse. Flour, potatoes, perhaps a single onion, luxuries were distant memories. She wasn't bitter, not truly. There was a quiet dignity in her self-sufficiency, a fragile contentment found in the familiar patterns. But loneliness was a heavy cloak she wore, especially in the evenings. The flickering blue light of the television offered poor company, casting dancing shadows that sometimes felt like mocking ghosts of happier times. She missed Arthur's booming laugh that could shake the dust from the rafters, his off-key humming as he worked in his shed, the comforting weight of his hand covering hers as they listened to the radio. Her neighbors exchanged polite nods, brief pleasantries about the unpredictable weather, but genuine connection felt like a shore receding with the tide. Her innate kindness, the gentle spirit Arthur had cherished, was often veiled by a quiet reserve, a self-protective shield against a world that felt increasingly indifferent to the quiet struggles of an elderly woman living alone on the edge of town. She felt overlooked, like a forgotten teacup on a high shelf. The storm that arrived wasn't gradual. It crashed upon Oakhaven with sudden, shocking violence. Rain didn't fall, it hammered, turning the garden paths into muddy streams. Wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the ancient oak tree in the back garden, threatening its heavy limbs. Agnes moved through the cottage with practiced efficiency, securing window latches that rattled ominously, stuffing old towels against the draft snaking under the back door. The house groaned around her, feeling smaller, more vulnerable against the tempest's fury. It was then, amidst the cacophony, that the sound returned, impossible to ignore. A series of high-pitched, utterly terrified whimpers, punctuated by frantic scratching sounds, emanating from just beyond the kitchen door. Heart thudding against her ribs with a mixture of apprehension and concern, Agnes pulled back the edge of the thin lace curtain. Her breath hitched. Huddled beneath the meager, thorny shelter of her unruly rose bushes, the ones Arthur had planted, stubbornly refusing to prune them into neat submission, was a dog. It wasn't large, maybe knee-high, but its condition was appalling. Its fur, a tangled mess of muddy brown and gray, clung sodden to its emaciated frame, revealing every sharp angle of its ribs and spine. It trembled violently, not just from cold, but seemingly from sheer terror, head tucked low, a picture of utter desolation. As she watched, rooted to the spot, it lifted its muzzle slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet across the rain-lashed space. Dark, soulful eyes, filled with exhaustion and fear so profound it mirrored the bleakest moment of Agnes's own solitude. The dog flinched instantly, pressing itself deeper into the mud and thorns, as if anticipating a blow. That look, that raw vulnerability, sliced through Agnes's preoccupation with her own dwindling resources. It wasn't just a stray. It was a fellow creature caught in the teeth of the storm, seemingly abandoned and utterly alone. Agnes stood frozen for a long moment by the back door, the cold draft seeping through the cracks, mirroring the chill of indecision in her heart. The image of her near-empty pantry warred with a heart-wrenching sight outside. That last loaf of bread. It represented warmth, sustenance, a small bulwark against a hunger that sometimes gnawed even at her own belly toward the end of the month. A stray dog could mean trouble. Fleas were almost certain. Maybe disease? What if it snapped out of fear? Her practical mind listed the potential problems, the costs, the risks. She thought of Mrs. Gable next door, her sharp eyes missing nothing, her sharper tongue quick to judge. But then she heard the wind howl again, felt the house shudder, and pictured the shivering creature outside, enduring the icy lash of the rain, the terrifying roar of the storm. She remembered nights huddled under blankets, feeling the chill not just in her bones, but in her soul, the profound ache of being utterly alone in the face of life's storms. Could she truly turn away? Could she choose self-preservation over compassion, knowing that creatures suffered just feet away? The internal debate lasted only moments, resolved not by logic, but by the quiet insistence of her own heart. Taking a deep, steadying breath, the kind she used to take before facing a stern bank manager or delivering difficult news, Agnes made her choice. She slid the bolt on the sturdy wooden door and pulled it open just a crack, the wind immediately snatching at it, trying to tear from her grasp. "Hello?" she called out, her voice thin against the gale. "It's okay, little one. You don't have to stay out there." The dog didn't react, only pressed itself flatter, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest, born more of fear than aggression. Agnes didn't push. She retreated into the relative warmth of her kitchen, the scent of old wood and dried herbs of familiar comfort. Her eyes fell on the loaf of bread. Without further hesitation, she took the serrated knife from the block and sliced the loaf cleanly in half. Not a meager crust, but a generous portion, dense and filling. She placed the bread onto an old tin plate, dented and worn from years of use in the garden. Returning to the door, she pushed it open a little wider this time, battling the wind's insistence. She carefully placed the plate just inside the threshold, on the dry patch of the small, stone-flagged mudroom. "Here you are," she murmured, her voice soft and low, deliberately unthreatening. "It's not a feast, but it's dry in here. Come on." She backed away slowly, retreating towards the perceived safety of her kitchen doorway, leaving the back door slightly ajar. She watched, holding her breath. Time seemed to stretch. The dog remained utterly still for what felt like an eternity, its dark eyes darting from the bread to Agnes, then back to the bread, assessing the risk, weighing hunger against fear. Finally, the primal urge for sustenance won. With a sudden burst of desperate courage, it scrambled up on trembling legs. It took one hesitant step inside, paused, ears flicking nervously, then another, a final, quick dash, and it snatched the bread from the plate. It didn't bolt back into the storm as Agnes half expected. Instead, it retreated only to the edge of the open doorway, wolfing down the bread in frantic, ragged bites, crumbs scattering on the stone floor. Once finished, it didn't leave. It simply curled into a tight, shivering ball just inside the shelter of the doorway, still exposed to the wind whipping around the corner, but no longer directly in the path of the driving rain. Its shivering lessened slightly. Agnes watched from her kitchen, a complex mix of emotions swirling within her. Pity, relief, a flicker of anxiety about her impulsive act, but overlaying it all, a surprising, quiet warmth spreading through her chest. The sacrifice of bread suddenly felt insignificant compared to the small measure of comfort she provided. An unspoken truce had been declared in the heart of the storm. The silence in her cottage felt fractionally less profound, punctuated now by the soft, rhythmic breathing of her unexpected guest. The storm raged on, imprisoning Oakhaven in a curtain of gray for 2 more relentless days and nights. The wind howled its mournful song, and the rain drummed a ceaseless rhythm on the cottage roof. Throughout it all, the stray dog remained, a silent sentinel near the back door. He never tried to venture further into the house, seeming content with the small patch of dry territory Agnes had implicitly granted him. He spent most of his time curled on an old, faded rag rug she placed there, occasionally lifting his head to watch her movements with those intelligent, wary eyes. Agnes, finding the silence too heavy to bear with another living creature now sharing her space, began calling him Buddy. It felt right. A simple, unassuming name for a companion who had appeared so unexpectedly out of the tempest. Her initial reserve began to melt away, replaced by a quiet, burgeoning sense of responsibility, and perhaps companionship. She shared her meager meals without a second thought now. A few spoonfuls of her morning porridge, cooled slightly, half of the baked potatoes she had for lunch, mashed with a tiny knob of precious butter, the broth strained from her simple vegetable soup in the evening. Buddy accepted each offering with quiet dignity, nudging her hand gently with his wet nose, his tail giving a tentative, almost imperceptible thump against the rug. He was still thin, still bore the marks of hardship, but the frantic edge of starvation had begun to recede from his eyes. Agnes found herself talking to him, filling the quiet spaces with the cadence of her voice. At first, it felt foolish, narrating her chores to a dog, but Buddy was an attentive listener, tilting his head as if pondering her words, his ears twitching at the changes in her tone. She told him about Arthur, about his terrible, singing voice but surprisingly light feet on the dance floor, about the time he tried to build a birdhouse that accidentally became a squirrel condominium, about his unwavering belief in finding something wonderful just around the corner. She pointed out the window towards the sodden garden, describing the colors of the roses in bloom, the sweet scent of the lavender hedge in summer. She spoke of her childhood on a farm far away, of milking cows before dawn and chasing chickens, memories she hadn't revisited in years surfaced, coaxed out by the presence of this silent, non-judgmental audience. Buddy, in turn, began to relax. He started following her, padding softly a few feet behind her as she moved from room to room, settling down with a soft sigh whenever she sat. He no longer flinched if her hand accidentally brushed against him. A fragile trust was being woven thread by tentative thread. During a quiet afternoon, while Agnes sat knitting and Buddy dozed near the warmth radiating from the old iron stove, she noticed the thing around his neck more clearly. It wasn't a proper collar, just a thin strip of dark, weathered leather, tied loosely like a thong necklace. Tucked under his chin, almost hidden by the matted fur, was a small bulge, suggesting the leather formed a tiny pouch. Curiosity sparked within her. Did it hold an owner's tag? A clue to his past? She longed to investigate, but the memory of his initial terror held her back, pushing him. Pry into whatever small mystery he carried felt wrong. It might shatter the delicate trust they were building. Patience, she told herself. Let him offer it, if he ever chose to. For now, his quiet companionship was the only treasure she needed. Her fragile peace was briefly disturbed by Mrs. Gable. During a temporary lull in the rain, Agnes stepped outside to clear a blocked drain pipe near the porch. Mrs. Gable's curtain twitched predictably, followed by her sharp voice cutting across the damp air. Agnes Carmichael, is that filthy mutt still here? I saw it lurking. Honestly, Agnes, you're too soft-hearted for your own good. Strays carry all sorts of ailments. You know, ringworm, mange, fleas. And what if it bites someone? You need to call the dog warden. Put an end to this foolishness. A surprising wave of defiance washed over Agnes. Normally, she might have mumbled an apology or tried to placate her neighbor. But looking back at the cottage door, where Buddy now stood watching, his head cocked, she felt a surge of protectiveness. His name is Buddy, Martha, she said, her voice calm but firm, louder than she intended. And he was caught in the storm, terrified and starving. He's causing no harm. He just needed a little kindness. Kindness is one thing, inviting trouble is another, Mrs. Gable retorted, punctuating her statement with a disapproving sniff before retreating behind her immaculate lace curtains. The encounter left Agnes feeling slightly shaken but strangely empowered. Buddy wasn't just a stray anymore. He was her responsibility, her companion. That evening, Agnes made a small detour on her way back from posting a letter. She stopped at Mr. Henderson's village shop, the bell above the door announcing her arrival with a cheerful jingle. Instead of buying a small bar of dark chocolate she usually allowed herself once a fortnight, a tiny indulgence that felt increasingly extravagant, she scanned the modest pet supply shelf. She picked up the smallest bag of dried dog kibble, checking the price twice. It cost nearly as much as her bread and milk for 2 days. Placing the bag on the counter, she counted out the coins carefully from her worn purse. Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow slightly, but said nothing. Back home, the sound of Buddy crunching gratefully on the plain brown kibble filled the small kitchen. It was a simple sound, yet it brought Agnes a deep, quiet satisfaction that far outweighed the fleeting pleasure of chocolate. Each shared meal, each soft word, each shared hour watching the rain, solidified the bond between the lonely woman and the lost dog. The cottage, despite the howling wind and the dwindling supplies, felt less like a place of solitude and more like a sanctuary. On the third morning, the world outside was transformed. The relentless assault of rain finally ceased, replaced by a stillness broken only by the cheerful dripping of water from eaves and leaves. A pale, watery sun tentatively pushed through the ragged edges of the clouds, casting long, weak shadows and painting streaks of hesitant gold across the glistening, rain-washed garden. The air smelled clean and sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth, bruised foliage, and the faint perfume of early, frost-resistant jasmine climbing the garden wall. Buddy seemed reborn. The lethargy induced by days of confinement vanished. He stretched luxuriantly on the back step, his tail giving energetic, happy thumps against the stone. His eyes, once clouded with fear, were bright and alert. As Agnes stepped onto the damp porch, intending to survey the minor damage, a scattering of twigs, drifts of sodden leaves, a clay pot overturned. Buddy whined excitedly and nudged her hand insistently with his cold, wet nose. Then, with a newfound purpose that startled her, he trotted decisively down the garden path, heading straight for the ancient, gnarled oak tree that stood sentinel at the far end. It was Arthur's favorite spot, the tree whose sprawling roots he claimed held the secrets of the land, the place he'd sit for hours with his sketchbook and thermos, lost in thought. Buddy stopped directly beneath the thickest, most prominent root, one that snaked visibly above the surface of the soil before plunging back into the earth. And then he began to dig, not the playful, haphazard digging of a dog burying a bone, but a focused, almost frantic excavation. His paws sent clumps of dark, damp earth flying backwards. He'd dig for a few moments, then pause, look back at Agnes with an urgent intensity, and let out a soft, insistent whine, as if commanding her attention, urging her participation. Agnes watched, a small smile playing on her lips. "What have you found there, boy?" she murmured. "A juicy worm? Or maybe you remember where you left that crust I gave you?" But Buddy's behavior was strangely specific. He ignored the surrounding earth, concentrating solely on that one spot beside the massive root. He whined again, louder this time, a note of frustration creeping into the sound. Then he did something truly peculiar. He lowered his head and nudged the small, worn leather pouch still tied around his neck. He pawed at it gently, looked pointedly at Agnes, then emphatically nudged the patch of disturbed earth again with his nose. A shiver, unrelated to the morning chill, traced its way down Agnes's spine. Arthur's whimsical stories, his obsession with this particular tree, the cryptic notes he used to leave, they suddenly didn't seem quite so fanciful. Buddy's insistence felt less like animal instinct and more like intent, like a message being delivered. Hesitantly, she walked across the squelching lawn, her old gardening boots sinking slightly into the wet grass. She knelt carefully beside the dog, the dampness immediately seeping through the knees of her trousers, her joints protesting the movement. "What is it, Buddy?" she asked softly, reaching out a tentative hand. To her surprise, Buddy didn't shy away. He pressed his head against her hand briefly, then nudged the leather pouch again. Encouraged, Agnes gently worked her fingers under the leather thong. It felt incredibly soft, worn smooth by time and elements. The knot, surprisingly simple, came undone with a gentle tug, as if it had been waiting for her touch. The small pouch fell open in her palm. It wasn't empty. Inside, protected from the damp by a wrapping of what looked like wax canvas, was a small, tightly rolled cylinder of parchment. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs. This was no mere identification tag. Her fingers, clumsy with a mixture of cold and sudden, inexplicable anticipation, trembled as she carefully eased the roll out. She unfurled it slowly. The ink was slightly faded, but instantly, undeniably recognizable. It was Arthur's handwriting. The familiar loops and swirls, the slightly impatient slant, and the drawing. It stopped her breath. It was a map, crudely sketched but detailed, of their garden. There was a cottage, the leaning shed, the rose bushes near the back door, even the crooked bird bath. Dominating the center was a careful rendering of the ancient oak tree. And right there at the base, precisely where Buddy had been digging, marked beside the largest root, was a thick, unmistakable X. Below the map, in Arthur's flowing script, were words that made her eyes prickle. "Where the roots run deep, so does my love." Followed by a sentence she dismissed as romantic nonsense years ago, but now resonated with impossible clarity, and maybe a little surprise from my dearest Agnes, for a rainy day. Tucked securely into a fold of the parchment, catching a stray glint of the emerging sunlight, was a small, tarnished brass key. Its shape was intricate, old-fashioned. Agnes stared dumbfounded. from the map to the earnest dog sitting patiently beside her, his tail now sweeping slow arcs in the mud, then to the patch of disturbed earth beneath the towering oak. Arthur's rainy day surprise, delivered, quite literally, by a stray who had appeared in the worst storm in recent memory. It felt dreamlike, plucked from the pages of one of Arthur's beloved adventure stories. Yet, the parchment felt real in her trembling hands. The key was solid, cool metal against her skin. And Buddy looked up at her, his dark eyes seeming to hold both ancient wisdom and simple, canine expectation. He nudged the map gently with his nose as if to say, "Well, what are you waiting for?" Agnes remained kneeling in the damp grass for a long moment, the world tilting slightly on its axis. The parchment map, Arthur's familiar script, the impossible timing, it felt like a conjuring trick, a message sent across the veil. Arthur's rainy day, phrase had always seemed metaphorical, a comforting sentiment. But this, the X marking the spot, the actual key, it suggested something tangible, something real he had hidden. And Buddy, how could this dog possibly know? Had Arthur somehow... No, that was fanciful thinking, the kind Arthur himself would have indulged in. Yet, the connection felt undeniable, magical even. Buddy whined again, a soft, encouraging sound, and nudged her hand more firmly towards the spot he'd begun to excavate. "All right, Arthur," Agnes whispered to the wind, her voice thick with unshed tears and a dawning sense of wonder. "All right, Buddy, let's see what secrets this old tree holds." Pushing herself up, her knees creaking in protest, she felt a surge of energy she hadn't experienced in years. A sense of purpose, mingled with grief and a fluttering, almost fearful hope. She walked towards a dilapidated wooden shed at the bottom of the garden, its familiar scent of dry earth, rusty metal, and stored onions strangely grounding. Leaning in its usual corner, coated in a fine layer of dust and cobwebs, was Arthur's favorite spade. Its ash handle was worn smooth and dark in patches from the grip of his hands. Its blade bore the scratches and scrapes of years spent turning this very soil. Lifting it felt like taking hold of a tangible piece of him. It felt heavier than she remembered, or perhaps it was the weight of anticipation settling in her chest. Returning to the oak tree, she saw Buddy watching her, his entire body quivering with contained excitement. He sat back slightly as she approached, giving her space but keeping his eyes fixed on the patch of disturbed earth. Agnes positioned the spade's blade precisely over the spot Buddy had indicated, aligning it with the X on the map she carefully placed on a dry stone nearby. She took a deep breath, the cool, clean air filling her lungs, steadying her nerves. Then, placing her worn boot on the spade's shoulder, she pushed down. The earth, softened by days of rain, yielded easily at first. She levered out clumps of dark, rich soil, tossing them aside. She dug methodically, rhythmically, the familiar motion strangely comforting amidst extraordinary circumstances. Sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool air. Buddy paced anxiously around the growing hole, peering in, occasionally letting out a soft bark, as if offering encouragement. Deeper she went, past a network of smaller roots near the surface. Then, perhaps a foot down, the spade struck something solid with a dull, heavy thud. Clang, not the sharp ring of hitting stone. This was different, metallic, heavy. Her heart leaped, hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Easy now, Agnes," she murmured to herself, her voice trembling slightly. Dropping the spade, she knelt again, ignoring the mud clinging to her clothes. With her bare hands, suddenly oblivious to the cold and damp, she began scrabbling at the soil, pushing it away from the obstruction. Her fingers brushed against cold, rough metal, pitted and textured with corrosion. Slowly, carefully, heart pounding, she worked the object free from the earth's embrace. It was heavier than she expected. A metal box, roughly the size of an old shoebox, dark with age and long burial. Its surface was oxidized, covered in clinging patches of damp soil. It looked ancient, sturdy, built to withstand time and secrecy. And set into the lid was a lock, a tarnished brass lock, intricately scrolled, matching the style and era of the small, peculiar key clutched tightly in her other hand. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She wiped her muddy fingers on her apron, then carefully cleaned the dirt away from the keyhole. With a hand that shook visibly, she inserted the small brass key. It slid in perfectly, smoothly, as if it had been waiting centuries for this moment. She hesitated for a heartbeat, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. What lay inside? Old coins, as Arthur had sometimes joked about his grandfather's supposed pirate hoard, love letters from his youth, or perhaps just sentimental trinkets, meaningful only to him. Taking one final, steadying breath, she turned the key. A faint, deeply satisfying click echoed in the quiet garden as the locking mechanism released. She lifted the heavy lid. There were no glittering jewels or pirate gold doubloons, but the sight that met Agnes's eyes caused tears to well instantly, blurring the contents into a watery haze. It was treasure nonetheless, Arthur's treasure, saved for her, stacked neatly, wrapped in protective oilcloth bundles tied with twine, were dozens of government savings bonds, purchased steadily over many, many years. Beside them lay a surprisingly heavy, dark velvet pouch, cinched tight with a drawstring. She loosened it, and the soft, unmistakable clink of metal against metal filled the air. Inside, spilling into her palm, were old silver dollars, heavy and cool, alongside a scattering of rarer, collectible coins. The very coins Arthur's grandfather was rumored to have amassed, the ones Agnes had long ago dismissed as family folklore or assumed had been sold off during leaner times. And resting gently on top of the coins and bonds, nestled in the center of the box, was a thick, cream-colored envelope. Addressed in Arthur's bold, familiar hand were just 4 words: "My dearest Agnes." Her hand shook so much she could barely pick it up. She sank back onto the damp grass, oblivious of the cold. Buddy pressing close against her side, offering his solid, warm presence as an anchor. She carefully opened the envelope. Inside were several pages, closely written, filled with the ink that held the essence of the man she had loved and lost. She read it right there, under the watchful branches of the ancient oak, the watery sun warm in her face, Buddy's soft breathing a steady rhythm beside her. It wasn't a map to further riches, but a testament to enduring love and quiet foresight. Arthur wrote with warmth and his characteristic gentle humor, apologizing that he hadn't found the grand adventures or buried fortunes he'd always dreamed of providing her. He spoke of his deep, unwavering love for her, his constant worry about her well-being, especially after he was gone. He explained how, over decades, starting even before they were married, he had secretly put aside small amounts whenever possible, skipping his lunchtime pint some weeks, selling a few non-essential tools, squirreling away birthday money. He bought the bonds incrementally, tucked away the inherited coins his grandfather had insisted were lucky, all with the sole intention of creating this hidden nest egg. "Just a little something, my love," he wrote, "to mend the roof or buy a warm winter coat, or simply to ease the worry lines I sometimes saw on your beautiful face when you thought I wasn't looking. Think of it as my way of still being there, holding your hand through the rainy days, even when I'm gone. Use it, Agnes. Use it to live comfortably, peacefully. Know that my love surrounds you always, deeper than these old tree roots, stronger than any storm." He ended the letter with a simple, "Forever yours, Arthur," and a postscript that made her sob anew. P.S. If you're reading this, perhaps one of Oakhaven's wandering souls help you find it. Be kind to them, Agnes. Kindness is the only magic I truly believe in. Tears streamed down Agnes's face now, hot and cleansing. Tears of profound, overwhelming relief from the burden of constant financial worry. Tears of renewed, aching grief for the thoughtful, loving, slightly eccentric man she missed more than words could say. Tears of incredible gratitude for his quiet planning, his enduring care that reached across time and circumstance. And tears of sheer wonder and affection for the scruffy, insistent dog who had, through some inexplicable miracle, acted as Arthur's final messenger. She turned and threw her arms around Buddy, burying her face in his thick, surprisingly clean-smelling fur. "Oh, Arthur!" she choked out between sobs, the name of prayer on her lips. "You wonderful, foolish, romantic man. You always did believe in finding treasure." She hugged Buddy tighter, feeling his solid warmth against her. "And you," she whispered into his fur, "you amazing, incredible dog. Arthur sent you, didn't he? You're the wandering soul." Buddy responded not with a bark, but by leaning heavily into her embrace, letting out a long, contented sigh, and then gently, tentatively, licking away the salty tears from her cheek. The sun broke fully through the clouds then, bathing the garden, the ancient oak, the open box, and the unlikely pair beside it in a warm, golden light. The world felt suddenly, profoundly abundant, not just with unexpected funds, but with love, connection, and a quiet miracle of kindness returned. Arthur's hidden legacy didn't turn Agnes into a jet-setting millionaire, nor did she desire such a transformation. The carefully saved bonds and old coins represented something far more valuable than extravagance. Security, dignity, and a profound relief of knowing she could face the future without the constant, gnawing fear of scarcity. It was the gift of peace. With quiet diligence and newfound confidence, Agnes arranged for the long-overdue repairs. Workmen arrived, fixing the leaky roof that had dripped into buckets during every downpour, replacing the rattling, drafty old windows with snug, modern ones, and adding thick insulation to the attic. The little cottage, once prone to chills and dampness, became a truly warm and cozy haven, holding the heat even on the frostiest winter nights. The change was palpable, not just in temperature, but in Agnes's own spirit. The worry lines that surround her eyes seemed to smooth out, replaced by a gentle serenity. Her pantry shelves were no longer sparsely populated, but comfortably stocked with staples and even a few small treats. A jar of good jam, imported tea, ingredients for baking Arthur's favorite scones. The crushing weight of financial anxiety lifted, allowing her shoulders to relax for the first time in years. Buddy, naturally, transitioned seamlessly from storm refugee to cherished king of the cottage. Agnes ensured he received the best care, regular checkups at the vet, nutritious food, a soft bed near the stove, though he often preferred a rug by Agnes's feet. He blossomed under the gentle attention, his coat growing thick and glossy, his tail perpetually wagging, his eyes bright with intelligence and unwavering devotion. He became her constant shadow, accompanying her on walks through the village, where even Mrs. Gable eventually offered a grudgingly polite nod, listening patiently to her stories, and filling the house with the comforting sounds of canine companionship, the click of his nails on the floorboards, his soft snores in the evening, the happy jingle of the new tag on his proper collar. The worn leather pouch he'd arrived with was carefully cleaned and placed on the mantelpiece, nestled beside Arthur's photograph and a tarnished brass key, tangible symbols of the incredible journey they had shared. Remembering the desperation in Buddy's eyes that first stormy night, and her own heart-wrenching hesitation born from scarcity, Agnes felt a deep calling to pay Arthur's final wish forward. Kindness, he had written, was the only magic. Taking a portion of the discovered funds, she contacted the small, often struggling local animal shelter. She didn't want recognition or plaques. She simply established a dedicated, anonymous fund, the Rainy Day Fund for Furry Friends. Its purpose was specific: to provide emergency financial assistance to local pet owners facing unexpected, unaffordable veterinary bills, particularly during times of hardship or severe weather. It ensured that others in Oakhaven might not have to make the agonizing choice between their own essential needs and a life of a beloved animal companion. It was her quiet way of honoring both Arthur's generous spirit and Buddy's miraculous arrival. Life settled into a new, richer rhythm in the cottage on the edge of town. Agnes continued to tend her garden, now planting flowers with cheerful abandon alongside her essential vegetables, Buddy often lounging nearby, diligently supervising the bees. She knitted warm sweaters and blankets, not just for herself, but donating many to the church bazaar. Evenings were spent reading by the fire, the silence no longer lonely but companionable, filled with a soft crackle of flames and Buddy's peaceful presence. Sometimes, gazing out the majestic old oak tree, its branches reaching toward the sky like protective arms, she would run her fingers over the smooth brass key or the worn leather pouch. She'd smile, feeling Arthur's love as a tangible warmth surrounding her. Sharing her last loaf of bread had seemed like such a small thing, an act born of simple empathy in the face of shared vulnerability. Yet, that single act of kindness had rippled outwards, bringing not just unforeseen security, but companionship, purpose, and profound, heartwarming reminder that even in the bleakest storms, connection can blossom, and the deepest treasures are often buried not in the ground, but within the human heart, waiting for an act of kindness to bring them into the light. The little cottage wasn't just a house anymore. It was a testament to love, loyalty, and the enduring, transformative power of compassion.